Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover the hidden, haunting, and unforgettable stories of America's past. Before we dive into today's tale, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our journey through history. Now, let's step back in time and explore the chilling tale of the Keller family tragedy, Auburn, New York's dark past. The early morning sun rose over Auburn, New York, casting a soft, golden glow on the small town's cobblestone streets and the quiet, brick-lined houses. The year was 1884, a time when the world was changing, yet many corners of America remained stubbornly familiar and rooted in old ways. In the heart of the town stood the Keller home, a modest but sturdy house, built by the hands of Jacob Keller, a man who had survived hardship, war, and the relentless passage of time. Jacob was a widower now, and his life had been a tapestry of triumphs and losses, each one leaving an indelible mark on the fabric of his heart. The Keller family, though not wealthy, carried themselves with dignity. They had a reputation for integrity, for honesty, and for an unwavering commitment to one another. Yet behind the neatly kept windows and the tidy yard, there was a tension that no one outside could sense. The tragedy that would envelop this family was not born in a day, nor in a single act. It had roots deep in human frailty, in the quiet missteps and unspoken resentments that grow slowly, like ivy climbing an old wall, unnoticed until it has taken hold of everything. Jacob's children Samuel, Clara, and little Ruth, heart and soul of the home. Samuel, the eldest at 22, bore the heavy burden of responsibility after the death of his mother years earlier. He worked in the local foundry, his hands calloused and strong, yet his eyes often betrayed a yearning for something beyond the narrow confines of Auburn. Clara, 17, was a striking young woman, sharp-witted, with an air of quiet mystery. The townspeople admired her beauty, yet whispered about her temper and restless spirit. Little Ruth, barely 10, was the fragile thread that seemed to hold the family together, her laughter a fleeting balm against the silent weight of sorrow that hung in the Keller household. It was a particularly cold spring morning when the first signs of the coming tragedy made themselves known. Jacob had risen before dawn, as was his habit, to tend to the small vegetable garden behind the house. The frost still clung stubbornly to the soil, and the air was sharp and biting. He worked with a quiet determination, the rhythm of his labor a meditation, a temporary escape from the worries that plagued his heart. Yet even as he planted seedlings, his mind wandered to the growing tension within his family. Samuel had been distant, withdrawing into long walks and quiet evenings at the foundry. Clara had become increasingly secretive, spending hours locked in her room, writing in journals that Jacob was never permitted to see. Ruth, sensing the unease, clung to her father with an instinctual fear she could not name. The first storm came in the form of a letter, delivered by a stranger on horseback, a man whose face was hard and unfamiliar. Jacob remembered the sensation vividly. The moment the letter touched his hand, a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air crept up his spine. It was a summons, a notice of unpaid debts from a distant relative who claimed a portion of the Keller property. The family had never been wealthy, but they had managed to scrape by, to keep the household together through years of toil and sacrifice. This letter, seemingly insignificant to the casual observer, carried with it a seed of despair. Jacob, unaccustomed to confrontation, felt his heart sink. The world outside was beginning to encroach on the fragile sanctuary of his home, and there was little he could do to shield his children from its reach. That evening, the tension in the house became palpable. Samuel returned from the foundry later than usual, his coat streaked with soot, his hands trembling slightly from the labor he performed each day. He carried with him news that the foundry itself was facing financial difficulties, that wages would be cut, and that some workers would be let go. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon him, and for the first time, Jacob saw a shadow cross his son's face, a shadow of hopelessness, fear, and the kind of despair that sometimes precedes irreversible actions. Clara, sensing her brother's distress, offered words of comfort, yet her voice was tinged with frustration. Arguments flared over dinner, small slights and long-standing grievances surfacing in ways that shocked even Ruth, who watched silently from her chair. The storm within the walls of the Keller home was gathering strength, invisible to the townsfolk outside, yet potent and dangerous. Night fell, and the family retired to their rooms with little peace. Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of his late wife and the realization that life's hardships were now pressing down on his children. Samuel, restless and brooding, stared out the window into the dark streets, the muffled sounds of the town a distant echo to his troubled thoughts. Clara, in the dim light of her candle, wrote furiously in her journal, her words a mix of hope and despair, confusion and longing. Ruth, curled beneath the covers, whispered prayers she barely understood, seeking solace in a God she feared might be as weary of their troubles as the world itself. The first signs of illness came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Samuel awoke one morning with a persistent cough, mild at first, but growing more severe with each passing day. Jacob, concerned but not yet alarmed, sought the advice of the local doctor, a kind man who had known the Kellers for years. The doctor diagnosed a simple respiratory infection, something that could be treated with rest and care. Yet, as the days passed, the illness spread to Clara, whose once bright eyes grew dull, her energy sapped by a fever that seemed relentless. Ruth, too, began to show signs of malaise. Her small frame weakened, her laughter fading into a silence that terrified her father. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, remarking on the strange maladies that had befallen the Kellers. Some suspected contagion, others hinted at something more sinister, yet no one dared to speak directly to Jacob about their fears. The weight of their concern pressed down on him, a constant reminder that the walls of his home were no shield against the forces that threatened to destroy it. Jacob himself felt a creeping helplessness, the kind that gnaws at the soul, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that cannot be filled by prayer or toiled at by the time spring had fully arrived. The Keller home had become a place of quiet despair. The once lively garden lay untended, the blooms of early flowers trampled by neglect. The town's church bells rang in the distance, a reminder of life continuing beyond the confines of Jacob's home, a cruel contrast to the suffering that had taken root within. Samuel's condition worsened, his cough deepening into a painful rasp that left him gasping for breath. Clara, frail and fevered, spent hours in restless sleep, haunted by dreams she could not explain. Ruth, small and frightened, clung to her father's side, her tiny hands gripping his coat as though she could anchor herself to the only semblance of safety. Remaining dot, it was in these dark days that whispers began to take shape into something more concrete. The townsfolk spoke of old family curses, of past misdeeds that had returned to claim the Kellers. Some suggested that the family's misfortune was divine punishment for sins long forgotten. Others feared that a more human malice was at play. Jacob, desperate and exhausted, dismissed these notions. Yet the words lingered in his mind, growing like shadows in the corners of his consciousness. He could not shake the feeling that their tragedy was not solely the result of circumstance, but of forces both seen and unseen, converging upon his family with relentless precision. And so the days continued, each one heavier than the last. Once proud Keller household had become a prison of illness, fear, and quiet despair. Jacob, racked with worry, tended to his children with unwavering devotion. Yet he could not mend the invisible fractures forming in their spirits. Samuel, who had always been strong and capable, now seemed like a fragile vessel, teetering on the brink of collapse. Clara's beauty, once a source of pride, had become a mask for the suffering that lay beneath. Ruth, the innocent heart of the family, watched helplessly as the shadows of fate closed in, her young mind struggling to comprehend the sorrow that seemed far too large for her tender years. The first part of the tragedy had begun not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow, creeping despair that touched every corner of the Keller home. Illness, worry, and whispered fears combined to create a pressure so intense that the very walls of their house seemed to shiver with it. And yet, amidst the darkness, there remained a flicker of hope, a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely. A belief that perhaps, somehow, they could endure, that the bonds of family might withstand the storm. The oppressive heat of summer came late that year, lingering into early July, and with it, the Keller home seemed to shrink under the weight of suffering. The sunlight that streamed through the windows no longer brought warmth or comfort. Instead, it highlighted the gaunt faces of Samuel and Clara, the dark circles under their eyes, and the pallor of Ruth's once rosy cheeks. Jacob, whose hair had begun to gray prematurely under the strain of worry, moved tirelessly from room to room, fetching water, preparing meals he could barely eat, and administering whatever care the local doctor prescribed. Yet the remedies seemed powerless against the invisible force that gripped his children. Neighbors noticed the decline. Mrs. Thompson, whose house stood across the street, spoke in hushed tones to those who would listen about the curse she felt hovering over the Keller home. Children on the streets, once eager to play near the Keller's yard, now crossed the street in fear or glanced with wide-eyed curiosity at the shuttered windows. Gossip spread like wildfire, each retelling growing more sinister than the last. Some claimed they had seen shadows moving across the windows at night, strange shapes that seemed to watch the town as it went about its normal life. Others whispered that the Kellers themselves were cursed, perhaps due to some hidden sin of Jacob's past or a failing unknown to anyone but the family. Jacob, always a man of reason, dismissed these notions, though at times, late at night, he too wondered if fate had turned against him in ways he could neither anticipate nor control. Samuel's illness had become debilitating. Days passed where he could barely rise from his bed, each breath a labor, each movement a trial. Jacob spent long hours by his side, rubbing his son's fevered brow and trying to feed him sips of water. Clara, despite her own weakening state, devoted herself to tending her brother, washing his soiled linens, preparing meals, and speaking to him softly in the moments when he had strength to respond. Their relationship, always complex, now deepened into a bond forged in suffering. Ruth, small and tender, often crawled into Samuel's bed to keep him company, her innocent voice murmuring words of comfort that no one else could provide. Doctor, a man who had seen the suffering of countless families over the years, grew increasingly concerned. He spoke to Jacob with frankness rarely used in small-town conversation. "I fear this is more than a simple illness," he admitted one evening, leaning heavily against the doorway of Samuel's dimly lit room. "There are signs of poisoning. It could be accidental, or it could be deliberate." Jacob felt the blood drain from his face, a chill creeping up his spine. Poisoning? The word seemed to hang in the air, impossible yet horrifyingly plausible. How could this happen in their quiet, familiar town, to the family he loved more than anything? His mind raced, trying to identify who could have such ill will toward them, yet no name came, only the gnawing realization that danger could be closer than he had ever imagined. The days blurred into nights, and each moment seemed heavier than the last. Samuel's strength waned, leaving him pale and thin, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Clara, though determined to care for him, began to show signs of weakness herself. Her journal entries, once filled with lively thoughts and private reflections, now detailed her fear, her despair, and the strange events that seemed to surround their household. She wrote of shadowy figures glimpsed at the edge of the yard, of whispered voices in the night, of a cold presence that seemed to linger where it should not. Ruth, too young to comprehend the full extent of their suffering, began to cry at odd moments, her small body racked with unexplained fevers and chills. Jacob, desperate for answers, sought the counsel of a traveling physician who had recently visited the county. The man, a stern figure with piercing eyes, examined the Kellers carefully, testing Samuel and Clara for signs of ingestion of harmful substances. "This is deliberate," the physician said quietly, his voice heavy with gravity. "I cannot say who, but the pattern is too precise to be accidental. Someone is targeting your family." Jacob felt a rage he had never known before, combined with a profound helplessness. He vowed, silently and fiercely, to protect his children, though he had little understanding of how he could confront an enemy so elusive. The nights grew longer, oppressive with heat and the weight of fear. The family slept in shifts, Jacob keeping vigil by Samuel's bedside, Clara watching over her brother when he drifted into restless slumber, and Ruth tucked between them, seeking comfort in the little security her parents could provide. House, once a place of laughter and quiet domesticity, had transformed into a chamber of anxiety. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the trees outside, triggering panic or dread. It was during one of these long nights that Jacob noticed something peculiar. A faint smell, metallic and acrid, lingered in the kitchen, almost imperceptible unless one had reason to detect it. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Someone had introduced poison into their food, their water, their very home. Panic rose, hot and suffocating. He searched every cupboard, every utensil, every surface, but found nothing conclusive. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Each member of the household had been systematically weakened, a calculated attack on those he loved most. The town of Auburn, meanwhile, continued its normal rhythm outside the Keller walls, unaware of the silent horror consuming one of its own families. Markets bustled, church bells rang, children played along the streets, and neighbors carried on with small talk and gossip, oblivious to the life-and-death struggle happening only doors away. The Kellers had become ghosts in their own home, visible only to one another, bound together by fear, illness, and the unspoken knowledge that their lives hung by a thread. Jacob, once a man of unwavering faith and reason, found himself questioning everything he had believed. How could such evil exist in a town that prided itself on morality and decency? How could the world allow the suffering of children, of families, of those who had done no wrong, to continue unchecked? The weight of grief and anger threatened to crush him, yet he pressed on, driven by the instinct to protect and the stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. And came the day that would change everything. It began like any other, with the oppressive heat of summer pressing down on the small town. Jacob rose early, checking on Samuel and Clara, noting their deteriorating conditions with a heavy heart. Ruth, as always, clung to him, sensing the tension and fear in her father's movements. It was during breakfast that the first irreversible signs of tragedy became undeniable. Samuel, too weak to stand, collapsed, gasping for breath. Clara, fevered and disoriented, tried to help him, only to falter herself. Ruth screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the house, summoning Jacob to the center of the disaster. Panic gripped him, raw and unrelenting. He rushed to Samuel, lifting him from the floor, feeling the fragile weight of his son's body, knowing that every second counted. Clara, barely conscious, muttered words he could not understand, her small hand reaching toward Samuel as if to shield him from the invisible hand of death. Ruth clung to Jacob, sobbing and trembling, her tiny body pressed against his chest, a last tether to the innocence and life that remained. The physician arrived, summoned in haste, yet even his knowledge and skill could not reverse the damage. The poison had done its work with cruel precision. Samuel's eyes closed for the last time, his breath ceasing, leaving Jacob to cradle a body that had been his pride and joy. Clara, weakened beyond repair, slipped into unconsciousness, her fate hanging in the balance. Ruth, inconsolable, cried for her brother, her small voice carrying a sorrow that no parent should witness, a grief that would never leave her heart. Tragedy that had begun as a slow, creeping despair had reached its climax. The Keller family, once a picture of quiet resilience and dignity, was shattered. Jacob, broken and grief-stricken, found himself alone with Ruth, the youngest thread of hope in a tapestry of suffering. The weight of the events pressed down upon him, the realization that their lives would never be the same, that the shadows that had crept into their home would linger, perhaps forever. And yet, even amidst the despair, there was a glimmer of determination. Jacob resolved, with every ounce of strength remaining in his battered body, to uncover the source of the poison, to seek justice for Samuel, and to protect Clara and Ruth from further harm. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger, suspicion, and heartbreak, but he would not falter. The tragedy had begun, yes, but it would not define the entirety of their story. Somewhere, hidden among the whispers and shadows, lay the truth, and Jacob was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The days following Samuel's death were unbearable. The sun rose and set over Auburn, indifferent to the agony that had taken root in the Keller home. Jacob moved like a man possessed, driven by grief, guilt, and an unrelenting desire to protect the two remaining members of his family. Clara, still feverish but stubbornly clinging to life, was a shadow of her former self. Her once sharp eyes, which had seen the world with both curiosity and skepticism, now appeared dull, haunted by fear and illness. Ruth, barely able to understand the permanence of what had happened, spent long hours sitting silently by her father's side, clutching a worn doll to her chest, her little body shivering despite the heat of summer. Jacob knew he could not allow this evil to continue unchecked. He began to investigate the circumstances surrounding the poisoning. The kitchen, the pantry, the well water, everything became suspect. Every person who had come into the house, even those trusted for years, was scrutinized in his mind. His town, once familiar and welcoming, now felt alien, a place full of hidden eyes and whispered threats. He began to question neighbors he had known for decades, searching for inconsistencies in their stories, any hint of malice or jealousy that could explain such deliberate cruelty. Rumors, of course, spread like wildfire. In a small town like Auburn, the story of Samuel's death and the mysterious illness of Clara and Ruth quickly became the subject of gossip. People whispered of jealousy, of grudges held over generations, of long-forgotten arguments that might have led to this unthinkable act. Some suggested that Clara, with her beauty and spirited nature, might have angered someone envious. Others speculated that Jacob, a man of integrity, but with known disputes over property and finances, might have unknowingly provoked a neighbor's resentment. None of these rumors brought comfort or clarity. They only deepened Jacob's despair, as he realized that truth and speculation were often indistinguishable in the minds of those desperate for answers. The town's authorities were slow to act. Auburn's police force, limited in both manpower and expertise, viewed the situation with caution. A poisoning case, particularly one within a respected family, required more evidence than whispered suspicions could provide. Jacob, frustrated and nearly broken, began documenting everything himself: what each family member had eaten, who had visited, when illnesses appeared, and any peculiar events he could recall. He wrote with painstaking care, his handwriting trembling. From grief and exhaustion, Every detail mattered. Every note could be the clue that revealed the identity of the person who had brought such devastation into their lives. Clara's condition fluctuated. On some mornings, she seemed almost lucid, speaking softly to Ruth, reminding her to eat or to rest. On other days, fevered visions consumed her, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she murmured fragments of sentences that made no sense, only adding to Jacob's terror. He found himself alternating between hope and despair with alarming frequency, clinging to the moments when her eyes recognized him, when her voice whispered his name, and fearing the inevitable relapse that always seemed to follow. Ruth, perceptive beyond her years, sensed the fragility of her sister's state. She would sit quietly, holding Clara's hand, humming little songs she had learned in church, her small voice an anchor to the family's rapidly diminishing normalcy. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Jacob received a visitor who would change the course of their investigation. A man named Elias Whitmore, a traveling chemist and amateur detective, had arrived in Auburn on business and heard of the Keller tragedy. He requested permission to examine the household, to test the water, the food, and anything else that might shed light on the mysterious illnesses. Jacob, desperate for any glimmer of hope, welcomed him despite the skepticism of the townsfolk. Whitmore's methods were meticulous. He collected samples, examined traces of residue, and questioned every member of the household with a patience that was almost unbearable to Jacob, whose heart raced with anxiety at every passing moment. The findings, when they came, were horrifying but clarifying. The chemist confirmed that the illnesses were not accidental, they were deliberate, the result of a slow-acting poison introduced into the household over time. The thought that someone had systematically targeted his family, that this had not been a random misfortune but an intentional act of cruelty, shook Jacob to his core. Whitmore's analysis suggested the use of arsenic, a substance known to be available in households and general stores of the time, but deadly in even small doses when administered carefully. The implications were chilling. Someone close enough to the Kellers to prepare food, to handle the family's utensils, or to come and go without suspicion, had orchestrated the suffering that had claimed Samuel's life and imperiled Clara and Ruth. Jacob's rage grew with every passing day. He felt the crushing weight of helplessness, but it was now intertwined with a burning need for justice. Auburn, a town he had once loved, seemed suddenly filled with shadows and hidden threats. He could no longer trust casual neighbors, casual acquaintances, or even those who had once seemed harmless. Every delivery of food, every visitor, every casual interaction was suspect. His grief, once inward and quiet, now erupted into determination, an unrelenting drive to protect the surviving members of his family and to unmask the perpetrator who had so ruthlessly brought misfortune into their lives. Clara, slowly recovering, under Jacob's constant care and Whitmore's guidance, began to regain some clarity. Though still weak, she provided crucial details that helped narrow the investigation. She recalled moments when someone had lingered suspiciously in the kitchen, small inconsistencies in the behavior of certain townsfolk, and a strange sense of being watched that she could not explain. Her observations, combined with Whitmore's chemical analysis, began to form a picture, one that pointed to a deliberate and calculated act rather than random misfortune. The townsfolk, meanwhile, became increasingly aware of the investigation. Curiosity, fear, and gossip blended into a tense atmosphere. The Keller's tragedy became both a cautionary tale and a subject of morbid fascination. Some townspeople offered assistance, bringing food and supplies, while others whispered behind closed doors, hinting at secrets they claimed to know, but dared not speak aloud. Auburn's collective conscience was stirred. People who had once ignored the subtle tensions in the town now found themselves questioning the nature of trust, of safety, and of human cruelty that could hide behind familiar faces and polite conversation. Summer edged into autumn. The investigation began to bear fruit. Whitmore's meticulous methods revealed small but telling details. Minute traces of poison on certain utensils, inconsistencies in visitor accounts, and a pattern of delivery times that coincided with moments of sudden illness. Jacob, driven by grief, memory, and determination, pieced together the puzzle with painstaking care. Every observation was a thread, every recollection a link in a chain leading toward a truth long hidden. Yet with each discovery, the tragedy deepened. Samuel was gone, and the thought of his absence haunted the house. Clara, though surviving, bore the scars of both illness and trauma. Ruth, still too young to fully comprehend, felt the weight of loss in ways that were visible in her quiet, withdrawn moments. Jacob, for all his strength and resilience, was a man transformed by grief, haunted by the memory of his firstborn's laughter, his struggles, and the inevitability of death that had visited his home with unrelenting precision. The town watched as the Keller family moved through the aftermath of tragedy. Jacob's quiet determination, Clara's tentative recovery, and Ruth's fragile innocence became symbols of both resilience and a lingering shadow of human cruelty. Auburn, a town that prided itself on morality, was forced to confront the reality that evil could exist even in familiar, seemingly safe spaces. The investigation continued, drawing in more of the community, and the story of the Keller family became both a warning and a testament to endurance under unimaginable strain. And so, the stage was set for the final chapter of this sorrowful tale. The threads of grief, investigation, and discovery were poised to converge, promising both revelation and further heartbreak. The dark past that had claimed the Keller family would not remain hidden forever, and the truth, when revealed, would shake the town to its core. Yet even as the shadow of tragedy loomed, the fragile spark of hope endured, carried in the small, resolute hands of Ruth, in the recovering strength of Clara, and in the unwavering resolve of Jacob Keller, a father determined that his family's suffering would not be in vain. Autumn settled over Auburn like a heavy quilt, the trees flaming in reds and golds, their falling leaves littering the streets with a quiet melancholy. Within the Keller home, the air was thick with anticipation, sorrow, and determination. Jacob, Clara, and Ruth had endured months of fear, illness, and uncertainty. The slow grind of time, the invisible hand of malevolence that had crept into their lives, had finally brought them to a point where answers were no longer a luxury, they were a necessity. Jacob had refused to let the events of the past months define them entirely, but the weight of loss was impossible to ignore. Samuel's absence haunted every corner of the house, every room, every heartbeat. Whitmore, the chemist and investigator who had devoted himself to uncovering the truth, returned to the Keller home one crisp morning with a mixture of caution and grim satisfaction. His work had borne fruit, small clues that collectively pointed to a person who had been lurking in plain sight. Jacob listened carefully as the man laid out the evidence. The carefully traced patterns of poison, a timing of visits, and subtle behaviors observed among the neighbors and townsfolk over the previous months. Each detail drew a map toward the perpetrator, a figure hidden by familiarity, yet revealed through meticulous observation and patience. The revelation, when it came, was both shocking and painful. The person responsible was someone Jacob had trusted, a neighbor who had visited under the guise of friendship, someone whose motives were rooted in envy and long-simmering resentment. The betrayal cut as deeply as the loss itself. To realize that human cruelty could hide behind polite conversation, behind smiles and shared history, was a blow almost too heavy to bear. Yet for Jacob, it was also a turning point. The tragedy that had consumed his family would not be allowed to remain unanswered. Confronting the perpetrator was a delicate and dangerous task. Jacob, accompanied by Whitmore and the local constable, approached the suspect's home with hearts pounding and hands trembling. The streets of Auburn were quiet that morning, the usual bustle muted, as though the town itself sensed the gravity of the moment. Jacob's mind raced, not with vengeance, but with the need to protect Clara and Ruth, to prevent further harm, and to see justice done for Samuel. The encounter, when it occurred, was tense and fraught with emotion. The perpetrator, caught in the undeniable web of evidence, attempted denial and deflection, but the mounting proof was insurmountable. At last, the confession was forced, a reluctant admission of envy, greed, and long-held resentment that had metastasized into deliberate cruelty. The town of Auburn was stunned. News of the perpetrator's identity spread quickly, a mixture of shock, anger, and relief rippling through the community. The Kellers, though scarred by months of suffering, were vindicated in the sense that their ordeal was understood for what it truly was. Samuel's death, Clara's near-fatal illness, and Ruth's terror had not been accidents, nor the result of divine punishment or random misfortune. They had been deliberate acts, born from human malice. Jacob, though deeply wounded by the betrayal, found a measure of peace in knowing the truth. Justice, slow and painful, had finally been served. Yet even as the perpetrator was held accountable, the emotional wounds remained. Samuel's absence was a constant ache, a shadow that would never lift. Clara, while recovering physically, carried the psychological scars of illness and betrayal, her trust in the world forever altered. Ruth, whose innocence had been tested beyond comprehension, began to understand that life could be cruel, that love and safety were fragile, and that her father's strength was both a shield and a guide in the world she had been forced to confront so early. Jacob himself was changed, his heart hardened by grief, but softened by the unwavering bond he had maintained with his surviving children Dot in the months that followed. The Keller household slowly regained a semblance of normalcy. The garden, once neglected, was tended once more, flowers blooming as if in defiance of the darkness that had fallen over the home. Clara resumed journaling, her words now reflecting both caution and resilience, her spirit tempered but not broken. Ruth began to laugh again, tentatively at first, her small voice a fragile echo of life returning to the house. Jacob, steadfast and enduring, found solace not in erasing the past, but in honoring it through remembrance, care, and the relentless effort to protect what remained of his family. The tragedy of the Keller family became a story told throughout Auburn, a cautionary tale of human cruelty and resilience. Parents spoke to their children of the importance of vigilance, of discernment, of the fragility of trust. Neighbors remembered that kindness could conceal danger, and that appearances were often deceiving. And yet, through it all, the Kellers. Endurance became a symbol of hope, a testament to the strength of familial bonds in the face of unimaginable suffering. Jacob often walked the streets of Auburn in quiet reflection, his mind revisiting the horrors and triumphs of the past year. He thought of Samuel, of the laughter that would never return, of the dreams that had been extinguished far too soon. He thought of Clara, recovering but forever changed, and of Ruth, whose spirit had been tested but remained unbroken. He carried the weight of grief, yes, but also a profound understanding of love, resilience, and the human capacity to endure even the darkest of trials. The years that followed brought healing in small, fragile increments. Auburn itself moved forward, the echoes of the Keller tragedy fading slowly, but never completely disappearing. The story of a family betrayed, poisoned, and nearly destroyed became part of the town's history, a reminder that tragedy could strike anywhere, and that courage, vigilance, and love were essential tools in the face of human malevolence. Jacob, Clara, and Ruth carried these lessons forward, shaping their lives around the knowledge that darkness could come unbidden, but light, love, determination, and familial devotion could endure and survive. In the quiet evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the town settled into stillness, Jacob would sit with Clara and Ruth, holding their hands and recounting stories of Samuel, of their shared past, and of the strength they had discovered within themselves. The tragedy that had so nearly consumed them remained a part of their lives, but it no longer defined them entirely. Auburn, a town both familiar and forever changed, bore witness to the resilience of a family who had faced the worst and emerged, scarred but unbroken, into the light of survival, remembrance, and hope. The Keller family tragedy remained, for generations, a story whispered in Auburn streets, a tale of sorrow, endurance, and the unbreakable bonds of family. And as the years passed, the memory of Samuel, the survival of Clara, and the fragile innocence of Ruth served as a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity's capacity for love, courage, and endurance could never be extinguished.